welcome back to the Phase podcast. This is the second episode in our series on coping with change, and a massive change that can be particularly difficult, where we might experience a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, I think, is changes around work, business, employment. And so in this podcast, that's what we're going to be thinking about. I'll be speaking to Sophie about the changes that have come with starting a new job, then talking to David about running a business, having to adapt to the change and maybe making changes that feel difficult. And then I'll be talking to Sarah, who's a strengths coach and is currently working with people who are unemployed due to the pandemic. Hi, Sophie. Thanks so much for joining us today. Do you want to start by just telling us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, so I'm Sophie, I'm 24. I have lived in Hitchin my entire life. I've grown up here. I've got a psychology degree from Oxford Brookes University, and I have volunteered with Phase as a virtual mentor for a little bit. I don't know how long I've done it, a few months now.
Fantastic. And so in this podcast, we're talking about change, how we can manage change better. Can you share an experience of a change that you've gone through and how you found it?
Yeah, so really recently, actually, I started a new job as a teaching assistant with Year 1 children at primary school in Stevenage. I've wanted to work with children for ages, but it was because due to the pandemic and just life, I had been in my previous job in a coffee shop for 6.5 years. So from this job where I was very settled in this job to a new one during a pandemic that was totally different colleagues and atmosphere. It was a bit daunting. It was a massive step, and it was a really big thing for me to do because I was sort of at the top of my old job in a management position. I was very settled. I knew the job inside out. I was full-time. Like I said, been doing it for 6.5 years, very comfortable. But the time had come, and the time had been coming for a long time for me to get a new job. And when I took this, it was a huge change. It totally changed my daily routine. I went from doing shift work to more 9 to 5, 8:30 till 4 work, which completely changed my availability, completely changed my daily routine. Like I'd normally have work early in the morning and have the afternoon off, or work later in the afternoon and have the morning off, whereas this was sort of a massive chunk of the day. And something I found really hard was I felt that time was just really running away from me. Like I didn't have as much extra time. And then something strange that I noticed as well was having my weekends free, which was massive for me because I've never had that before. But then anything you wanted to do on a weekend was always full of people, and it was heaving. And then with COVID, I think that was like, wow, now everything I do is really, really busy. And speaking of COVID, going into my new job, I felt the pressure because if I was to come down with the virus at the time, with all bubbles and schools and things, I would have sent home 90 children, and that's 90 families that would have been affected because I'd got COVID. And that thought was just always in the back of my mind. And I hadn't had to think about that really, because in the coffee shop, you were like behind perspex glass, you were masks on, PPE, you never really got too close to anyone. And I actually left just before cafes and things reopened, so we were a takeaway model only. So generally I felt quite safe. And then it was sort of stepping out to actually I'm now a lot more at risk, because 5 and 6-year-old children, they don't know how to social distance, they don't know how to do all of that.
Yeah, there's like a whole nother element of change, isn't it? Like not just a new job, but actually a different risk level and stuff.
100%. And I went from being sort of like I knew the job like the back of my hand to I didn't have any experience really in this new job. I think I sold myself quite well, but realistically I hadn't done anything like it before. So there was lots that I was being asked to do that I just didn't know how to do.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of Googling on my phone, like in the toilet, like, how do you do this?
Yeah.
What does this mean?
Yeah. So how do you think that change affected you or impacted you?
Well, it was really mixed, because I was loving life, having a new job, doing something that I'm really passionate about and I really wanted to do, working with children. Every day is different and interesting. But then at the same time, I didn't sort of like know what I was doing. So I was very stressed and anxious about that. So it was like the real excitement of, yeah, I've got a new job. It's doing something like meaningful. It's doing something that I want to do. But actually, I haven't done anything like this before, and it's really scary. And I was absolutely exhausted in those first few weeks when I came home from work. I would just sit on the sofa and just flop. It was, which wasn't helpful, because then I wasn't getting anything done. And then it was just that constant feeling of being behind, but I was still really enjoying it. So it was like a real mixture of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's quite common, isn't it, when things are really changing and you're feeling a bit overwhelmed. So what is one way that you've learned to cope with that change in this situation?
So sort of tackling that, coming home and doing nothing, I found that implementing just a really basic routine in my life when I got home, like the first thing I would do when I got home was always have a coffee and a biscuit. And I was like, that was my time to just, relax and sort of like digest the day in a way.
Yeah.
And then having that routine of like, right, next, like just simple chores, like I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do this, and sticking to that every day, so that I'd had this massive change in my work life and I didn't really know whether I was coming or going, like in the daytime, but to know that when I got home I had that sort of stable. Not every day was the same, because that's not realistic, but it was every day I knew what was going to be happening. I knew what I had to get done. It was almost like checking a list off. And making sure to sort of like include self-care in that too. So bubble baths and just making sure that I'm reading a book and having good food, wasn't just coming home and eating rubbish.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's all really helpful stuff. But what is some of maybe the hurdles or the challenges to putting those things in place?
Oh, definitely just the tendency to just sit on your phone. Like, it's so easy to sit down and just scroll through your phone. And then even if you're not even doing anything, you're just sort of scrolling through tweets that you're not even reading. I find half the time I'm not even taking it in. Then all of a sudden it's been genuinely like 2 hours and I've accomplished nothing. I feel no better. In fact, I probably feel worse. I've probably got a bit of a phone headache from being on a screen. And just the tiredness of it all, I think, because it can be so overwhelming, having that new change and having so much to think about and to do, that the tendency to just sit at home and do nothing,
procrastinate
is so strong. And I found myself doing it, where it would get to sort of like 5-6 o'clock and I'd be like, oh, like, what am I actually doing? And like, in terms of like the whole tiredness thing, I would genuinely sit and fall asleep. I would fall asleep on the sofa after I got home from work, and it wasn't helping at all, because then at night I wasn't sleeping and I was getting up. I wasn't getting up any early. In fact, I was getting up later than sometimes I'd have to for my previous job, but it was consistently sort of like 7 o'clock, which isn't that early, I understand, but it's still early. And I would use, in my old job, I would use sort of like my later starts to catch up on sleep. But where it's like Monday to Friday, every day getting up at 7, sometimes before 7, if I was to then fall asleep like after work, then I wouldn't sleep at night, and it would just mess up my whole nighttime routine. And then I'd be tired going into work, and then I'd feel even more behind, even more overwhelmed, because I was dealing with tiredness as well. So I think the tendency, those two main things, like feeling really tired and the tendency to just sit and mold almost.
And having a good sleep routine is so important, isn't it? Kind of, if your sleep pattern's off, it impacts just everything else. There's a knock on.
I cannot advocate enough for having a good night's sleep. Like, having a good night's sleep is game changing. Even if you're not going through a big change, even if you're just living your daily life and you're feeling a bit meh, getting a regular good night's sleep, it puts you in such a better position to face the day.
Yeah, to manage your emotions, to think rationally.
100%.
Absolutely. That's great. So if people are listening and they kind of relate to some of these changes that you're going through, or they, think that this is really helpful advice, what would you say is one practical step that they could take, or one thing they could do to start putting this in place?
Definitely implement that routine. And it doesn't have to be like you have to fill every second and every minute and you have to plan things down to the minute, but just set yourself a job or a couple of jobs to do of an evening, of an afternoon. If you've started a new job and you get home, make sure you've done something almost productive. And it could be something as simple as like making your bed or just giving the floor a bit of a hoover. But then keeping those things the same throughout the week and throughout, so like on Tuesdays I do this and on Wednesdays I do this.
Yeah.
And definitely including some self-care in that routine. And by self-care, it doesn't mean like, I don't mean get your pamper kit out, but like a bubble bath will always help me. But just reading, it's just doing something that's not sat there on your phone, inches away from your face.
Yeah.
Just staring blankly at a TV screen. Just something that you enjoy, that calms you. And just keep that in that routine and just do a little bit every day. Just look after yourself.
Yeah. And get good sleep.
And get a good sleep, 100%. Yeah.
Fantastic.
My top tip.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to add before we go?
I think I've said my piece. I think
fantastic.
I've covered it all.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sophie. That's been brilliant. Really helpful.
No problem. It was great to chat.
See you later.
Bye.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast. Would you mind just telling us a bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my name's David. I'm a businessman from Hitchin. We have a garage that does servicing and repairs. We work with FaZe a little bit on some kind of some projects, and I also do a bit of property development.
Brilliant, thank you. And obviously we're here today thinking about change. So would you mind just telling us a bit about a change that you have experienced?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the biggest changes was in the business. Probably 2016, obviously Brexit hit us. We honestly expected the vote to go the other way. And we'd recently kind of expanded the business. We've taken on a big showroom. We've invested quite a lot of money into stock and the building and kitting that out. And then from overnight, probably the sales that we're doing in car sales went from 40 cars a month to 20 cars. So it just, people just didn't want to spend money on big ticket items. And we were in a bit of a problem, really. Revenue had dropped, and basically we needed to find a way out of it, because at the end of the day we were losing money, and we lost quite a lot of money that year. And we've gone from each year kind of building the business and building and making stronger and stronger profits, just going absolutely reverse. It was going the other direction. So we just needed to look at the business, and we decided that we wanted to shut that branch down, basically, which meant making a few people redundant. It was obviously a hit to the pride as well, because I was trying to build a business, and it was a pretty difficult time.
Oh wow, yeah, that's tough. There's quite a lot of big changes that you had to think about as well, and it sounds like in a pretty short space of time. How do you feel about that change and how it affected you?
Yeah, well, it was a really difficult time, because, as I said, at the point, it was when we were selling cars. Obviously, it's quite a cash intensive business, and we had a lot of money tied up in cars, and suddenly you weren't selling them. And I would find myself, there was a few holidays with the families that I had to kind of cancel and things like that, because I felt like I needed to be there to kind of to help the business and try and drive it forward, to try and save it, basically. So that was a really difficult time. I felt extremely stressed. And then when the decision came to actually close down the branch, having to make the staff redundant and, make those choices was a really difficult thing. But I had to think about the overall business and kind of just keep moving forward with the end goal in mind. And unfortunately, it all kind of worked out.
Yeah, and you mentioned feeling stressed. How did that stress affect you and affect your well-being?
Yeah, it wasn't great. So, luckily I've got a lot of support around me. My dad's fairly close to me, and, we were in business together at the time. My wife is very supportive and she kind of realized these things. But, I think stress for me is the first thing it affects with me is my sleep. And it's kind of a bit of a downward spiral, because the less you sleep, the more your mind's not working properly. So I just try to kind of do simple things like exercise quite a lot to kind of keep your mental stability there. And I find that exercise always helps me sleep a lot better. And just trying to switch off from work sometimes, just put away the technology in the evening and things like that. So that's how I kind of cope with that. So I'd say, kind of exercise, sleep, and just eating well kind of helps with all those things.
Oh gosh, yes, such simple steps, but so important. They make such a big difference. If someone was listening to this and they're struggling with some of those things like sleeping well or exercising, what practical steps would you suggest that they take first?
I mean, for me, when I was stressed, obviously you couldn't really control being able to sleep well. That was something that you kind of had to manage the other parts of your life quite well to be able to do that. So, for instance, exercise. What I found really helpful, if I needed to go out for a run, I wouldn't think to myself, I need to go out and run 10K. I would think, right, just go and put on my trainers. Then that's done. Okay, just go out on the door and just run up the road. And once you're there and you're doing it, you just keep doing it. So, you'll go and do that 10K instead of just like thinking, oh, I'm in bed and I can't be bothered. So I'd say kind of break it down into bite-sized steps and just think, what can I be doing? Just don't try and take on too much and just take it one step at a time, basically. So yeah, and the same with eating well and things like that. Just try and do a bit of preparation to make sure you've got the right food in your fridge, and you've got, you're getting rid of all the bad food and that's not available. So when you do have a low moment, you're not reaching for food that's not going to be, good for you, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Is there anything else you would share about things that you've learned through this experience in coping with change?
Yeah, I think in the end of the day, as I said, in that period of time, I had to make quite a few people redundant, and it was a really difficult time. And at the time, they were really upset. But on the bigger scale of things, I think sometimes change can be a really good thing. I believe that they're in a better place now when they found jobs that maybe they're a bit more happy doing, and that's been able to kind of lead on to opportunities. And I feel that the only thing that is set in life is that everything's going to change. So the ability to be able to change and the ability to be able to kind of adapt to what's going on is really paramount. I'm sure we all know, for me in my trade, in being in cars, in probably 20 years time, cars are all going to be driving themselves. They're all going to be electric and things like that. So as a business, I need to think about how I'm always changing and adapting to the marketplace. And sometimes these changes are forced on you, but it can progress you in your kind of your mindset and your journey in life, basically.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I like that. I think if there's one thing we've learned this year, it's that change is always, like, there's unexpected change. Things could happen that we're never going to expect. So being prepared for those changes and
absolutely. There's been businesses out there who have like really thrived because they've been able to kind of implement things into their kind of day-to-day work, and like pubs who are now serving food and delivering and being able to order on apps. That's stuff that's not going to go away now. That's always going to be there, and that's probably improvement to before the pandemic. So I think change can be really positive. It can kind of force your hand sometimes to be innovative and things like that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I think you're right. Changing our perspective is so key. When we recognise that there can be positives if we choose to find them. Yeah, brilliant. Well, it's been great talking to you, David. Thank you so much for all that you've shared.
No problem.
Bye. Great. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for being with us today. Would you mind just telling us a bit about who you are and what you do to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, good to be here. So I'm Sarah and I am a Gallup strengths coach. So in terms of what is a strengths coach, so strengths are all about our natural talents, the things that we naturally do well. And so my role is really about helping people to be the best that they can be and to do more of what they do best as well. So at the moment, I work within employability. And so I deliver one-to-one and group coaching sessions to people who are out of work, a lot of them as a result of the pandemic, and support them on their route back into finding work and finding work that's really meaningful to them as well.
Mm-hmm. And so you kind of mentioned it a little bit there, but what are some of the changes that you've seen people experience in the last 18 months or during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I'm sure as many people will be aware, in terms of work and unemployment, there have been massive changes. So that could be people being made redundant, maybe people were in employment before or during the pandemic and are no longer employed, so they're unemployed, might have lost their job as well. And another change we've really seen as well in terms of research that's been done recently in terms of work is what people want from work. And so there's been a recent study and it showed that about 65% of people, they're now saying that in terms of their job and work, they really want their work just have that sense of purpose and for it to be really meaningful. And I think sometimes it's when difficult things happen, we really reevaluate what is most important to us. And even if we think back to March 2020, so just before the first lockdown, there are about just under 1.5 million people who were searching for work. And if we fast forward a year later into sort of March, April 2021, so this year, we're looking at over 2.5 million people who were then searching for work.
Wow.
So a really big shift in employment.
Yeah, that's a massive number. And obviously a massive change for people. So how do you see that change affecting people?
Yeah, well, again, so for lots of people, that would have actually been that they lost their job. And we have to remember that losing your job, it's the same as losing anything. It's a sense of loss. It's a form of grief, and it can be a massive shock. And I think sometimes we forget this, and particularly if you're the person in that situation, and we forget that it really is a form of grief, and it can be really stressful time. People may have been in employment, maybe they've been in their work or role for 5, 10, 20 years, and it's suddenly come to an end. It can be very unexpected as well, and really how it happens as well in terms of how you find out that your work will be ending, that really impacts like how you deal with it and how you can really move forward with it as well, because sometimes we can get stuck in a bit of a state of shock. And a question people are often asking is like, oh my goodness, like where do I go from here? You know, they've been used to getting up and going to work and having that routine, and then all of a sudden, sometimes overnight, or the difference between a Friday to a Monday, all of a sudden that isn't there. So a very difficult time for anyone in that situation.
And how, in the stuff that you've been doing with people, what is the ways that we can help people to cope with change better, or cope with that change specifically?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it is all those pillars of well-being that I know you guys are always talking about, and that is always your starting point. It's almost like sometimes it can feel that all sense of direction goes, and that people can really lose their bearings as well. And sometimes the way I describe it is even on the path back into employment, it can feel a bit of a roller coaster experience, because it comes with the highs and the lows. Sometimes you might wake up and maybe you kind of think, right, okay, I've got this, right, let's start looking for work, and feel more motivated. And then maybe you might even come across a job and you think, oh, this job looks really great, like I'm going to apply for this. But then maybe you never hear back from the application, or maybe you get as far as having an interview, but then you don't get the job. And so it's full of these highs and lows. So the first thing is always, remember and prioritize your well-being. And one thing people tend to find helpful is to sometimes shift their perspective and how they view this situation. And so sometimes it can feel like, oh my goodness, like I'm never going to get back into a job I enjoy, or a secure job, or whatever it is that's really important to you about work. And, when you've applied for that many jobs, it can be really difficult and you have to keep going. It can be exhausting as well. But something you can do is try to shift your perspective a little bit, to think, okay, well, if I look at this from a different point of view, what would this time give me that I would never have otherwise had? So although sometimes you might feel like, oh, I've got too much time, it might be worth thinking, well, actually, like, how can I use this time? Like, what are my skills? Like, what have I enjoyed about previous work, work, I was going to say experience, but I do mean work experience, but that could be your paid work as well as, voluntary work, or any experiences at work. But it's really going, okay, this does give me an opportunity just to reflect on some of your work experiences up until this point, and you get to discover a bit more about your skills, your strengths, your interests, your values, and even your goals as well.
Yeah, that's great. So if people are listening and they've faced some of these changes that you've talked about, what's a really practical step or a practical activity that they can do to help them find that perspective?
Yeah, good question. Sometimes easier said than done. But yeah, definitely. So one thing I would always encourage people to do is actually just to grab pen and paper and start to put even some of your thoughts and ideas onto paper. And so even now, I can do a bit of a working session and say these questions that I ask, like, I would encourage people to, listen back to this podcast and listen to a question, pause it and write your answers. You don't need to write long answers, but just start to be curious, and spend a little bit of time thinking about what is important to you. So shall I maybe go through some questions?
Yeah, great. Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll read the questions out. I won't really pause between, with the point that you can go back and listen to them afterwards.
Yeah.
So the first question I would always ask people to think about would be about a good day that you've had at work previously. So the question would be, what made a great day at work for you? And then when you've written that down, write also, why was it a great day? What was it about that day that maybe you just felt really energized, or you felt really motivated? So I'll move on to the next one. Like I said, I'll go quite quickly, but please do go back and pause and answer them as we go through the questions. So then the next question would be, what were you doing on your best day at work? So you might want to think about, what were the skills that you were using? Where were you? What was it specifically that you were doing? And then have a think about what made you happy at work. And whatever you write, this is kind of a little side note to yourself, like, this is what you want to be doing more of every day. So it might be that you were connecting with people. Maybe it was that you were analysing maybe some figures, or whatever it was that made you happy. think, right, okay, how can I do more of this?
Yeah.
And something linked to that as well could be even think back to maybe meetings you've had with your managers or colleagues and think about the positive feedback that they've given you, and write down and remember some of that positive feedback that you've received. And that might also help to reflect some of your greatest achievements at work as well. And even with that, you can take it a step further to go, well, how did I manage to achieve that? What skills was I using? What resources was I using? Maybe what knowledge was I using? And even with that, you can think, well, what was the very best part of that achievement for me? And then just very finally, a question I would encourage you to think about is, what would make meaningful work for you? Or you might phrase it also, what would meaningful work look like for you? And that's going to be different for everyone, and that is absolutely fine. And that really just comes from that figure I was sharing earlier, about 65% of people today saying that really what they're looking for in terms of work is that it is meaningful to them. And so once you've had a chance to sit down and write your answers, and again, it might be a half an hour, or even it might go to 45 minutes of just writing down those answers, what I'd encourage you to do then is to then think, okay, well, what are some of the common words that have come up? What are some of the common themes? And you might even notice that you're talking about specific roles or specific tasks that you've enjoyed as well. But just start to gather these like all into one place, and hopefully it will give you some new insights about work and what you would like more of in your workplace.
That's brilliant. Thank you. That was so helpful. I think that's a great tool. Can I just ask, is that so you could use that for someone that's unemployed, or for somebody that's just thinking, I need a change, I want to do something that's more meaningful?
Absolutely, yes. So this could be literally for anybody. So yeah, it could be somebody who maybe they've been made unemployed and they're thinking about work or career, or even like vocation, or even calling. It might be someone who maybe has been out of work for a while, maybe out of their choice, and they're beginning to think, oh, okay, right, I'm gonna start thinking about work. You know, what is it? Where do I want to be working? Like, what would motivate me? It might be someone who's currently in a role and feeling like, oh, do you know what? Like, I just want a bit of a change, or maybe they kind of feel ready for a bit of a development step, a bit of progression.
Okay.
And it doesn't always have to be that everything's always sort of progressing upwards. It might be that you think, okay, I've always done this kind of a role, but what would it look like if I just did a slightly different role as well? So yeah, whether you're in employment or not employment, those questions will definitely give you some new insights.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. Great. Some really interesting conversations. Again, I love what David was saying about our mindset and our perspective, because change is inevitable. And so the more that we choose to see it as a positive or see the opportunities, it's going to really help us. Also, a great reminder from Sarah that change can be a positive opportunity to rethink, to reflect on what's important to us and what we want out of our life or out of our work. So yeah, I really hope that you found some of those thoughts useful. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our final episode. Remember that you can also find us on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter @FazeHitchin.